time for us to start this. Shalom Aleichem! So Dayenu was in honor of the COVID-19 horrible Magefe. Dayenu, showing enough already. We don't want you anymore, we want you to go. But in the meantime, you're here. So while you're here, we are going to come to you live. I am so honored and pleased to have been asked to do this Facebook Live event for the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. And I have a very dear and close relationship with the Folksbiene. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Avi Hoffman. Shalom Aleichem. This is my dear friend, Philip Hinton.
Shalom Aleichem.
There you go. I taught him that. And I am dedicating tonight's presentation to someone who we loved very dearly. Most of us at the Folksbiene, and certainly Zalman and Moshe and everyone involved in the Golden Land, all the way back to the 80s, knew our dear friend Michael Larson, who passed away a few years ago. And he was beloved in the Yiddish theater world. He worked with some of the greatest performers in the Yiddish theater, Theo Bickel and Brucey Adler, and so many others, including myself. And so I'm dedicating this performance to the memory of Michael Larson. Mwah! Zolehum malichtiken Gan Eden. May he have a bright and beautiful Garden of Eden. I am here to talk to you about my life in the Yiddish theater. I've never done one of these Facebook Live events. Hopefully you can all see me and everything's fine. You can hear me fine. I would like to actually begin with a monologue, a Yiddish monologue, a Yiddish theater monologue that was written by the greatest Yiddish writer of all time. His name was Velvel Shikl Pirovsky. You may not recognize the name because he changed his name very early in his career, but his works have actually been translated into just about every language in the world. They've been produced in probably every country in the world, and I would like to present his most famous monologue, but I would like to do it in the language in which it was originally written, and it goes something like this. Zu sein oder nicht zu sein, hat da liegt der Hund begraben. Es ist etwas noble, auszustehen, die Pfeilen beugens von dem Paskud dem Geul, oder sich stellen am gegen dem Jam mit Zures. Und einmal vor allem macht ein Eck. Asof, Potteranese, genug, fertig! Ich hab schon nicht kein Geuer! Thank you very much, thank you. For those of you who have no idea what just happened, for those of you who just got a little frightened, don't be afraid. That was Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, in the Yiddish language. Now, I know that Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, did not write in Yiddish, and I know that he did not change his name from Velvel Shikl Pirovsky to William Shakespeare. I know all that. But you see, I was born in a little shtetl. You know what a shtetl is? It's a little village. I was born in a tiny little shtetl called the Bronx. And where I grew up, it was the Kingsbridge area. I grew up on Sedgwick Avenue, and I'll talk a little bit about that later because so many of the people that you know in the Yiddish world came out of our little enclave in the Bronx. And where I grew up on Bainbridge were some of the great Yiddish families to this day. Zalman Molotic and his family, the Schechters, the Gottesmans, the Fishmans, the Gottliebs, the Valetskis, and our family, the Hoffmans. We all grew up around this one Shalom Aleichem Volksschule, number 21, which is still there on Bainbridge Avenue, and it still operates as a Yiddish cultural center, the Shalom Aleichem Cultural Center on Bainbridge Avenue in the Bronx. Some of you who are watching right now probably still live in the Goddessman house on Bainbridge Avenue. So, Shalom Aleichem Chevres, it's good to say. It's good to see you. But when I grew up there, everybody spoke in Yiddish. My first language, my mama loshen, was Yiddish. And so I didn't learn until much, much later that English was actually a thing. Can you imagine growing up in a world where everything was in Yiddish? I grew up believing that all the great literature in the world had originally been written in Yiddish. See, I thought that Tennessee Williams came from Williamsburg, and he changed his name because he thought it sounded a little too Jewish. I thought that Eugene O'Neill was very proud when his family finally got their first refrigerator, and he wrote a play called Der Eismann Kimmelt, the Iceman cometh. What if all the great theater and all the great musicals had originally been written in Yiddish? Do any of you know who, I'm sure you do, who Israel Berlin was? Israel Berlin, of course, was the great American composer Irving Berlin, and he wrote a song that was very, very popular on 2nd Avenue in the Yiddish theater. Ich chulem von a weiße Chaneke, azoi wie setz sich mir im Kopf, wie die Babel krächzen und Kinder lechzen und im Beblach quatschken sich in Tod. And then, of course, there was another great musical written on the theme of Hanukkah. It was called My Fair Latke. And then, of course, there were the Gershwin brothers, who wrote some of the greatest musicals of all time, including this song, which comes from what is now a classic, Porgy and Boshy. Ich hab plenty of Guldish, and Guldish is plenty for me. Ich hab kein Geld, ich hab kein Feld, ich hab Guldish zu dir. Die Folks mit plenty of plenty, sie verschließen die Tür. Sie haben eure, wenn sie Bagantinnen, oi weiß mir, it's clear. Now, if the whole world were in Yiddish, that in the past several decades, we would have seen a great influx of great new Yiddish productions from a whole new generation of Yiddish speakers. The British Yiddish, the B'nai Brits, led by the incredible producer Cameron Humintosh, we now have these modern Yiddish classics to enjoy. Und ich hör nicht kein Meisel, die Livone vergescheu, noch sie schmeichelt allein. In die Lichtbach, der seh ich bald durch Schmutz bei die Fies, und der Wind hebt uns zu weinen. That, of course, comes from the beautiful story of a Jewish deli owner on the Lower East Side of London. Cats. Another great Humintosh production, of course, is that powerful political musical all about herring boats in South America. Vita. Wein nicht für mir Argentina, sie semes hob dich verloren, gegessen Hering, gewein Mischige, ich schwör dir Liebe, ich will werden Krieger. That, of course, was made into a movie starring a very famous Jewish actress, Madonna. Of course, when I grew up, I realized that not everything was written in Yiddish. Some things were actually written in Yinglish. Yinglish, of course, is a combination of Yiddish and English mixed together. Rogers and Hammerstein wrote a musical all about a group of elderly people complaining about their ailments in a senior home somewhere in the Midwest. The title song went like this. Oh, glaucoma, then you can't see further than your nose. When I move in your feet, my sure looks sweet, but I can't see anything up close. Oh, glaucoma. And I would like to end my little opening section here with a very famous song, all about an Italian Jewish mother concerned for the welfare of her child. This song comes from a very, very famous Yiddish musical called Mama La Mangia. So eat, just a bissale, eat, nuez, or you'll tear me apart. I slaved all day long in the kitchen, so eat, you are breaking my heart. Thank you.
Excuse me for interrupting.
Yes.
The top of your head is cut off,
Really?
especially when you stand.
Oh no, so let me, could you come down? Well, I'll fix it. I'll fix it, excuse me. The top of my head is cut off, especially when I stand. No, I believe you, I believe you. I can,
Ariel.
thank you. Oh, there you go. All right.
And you're completely cut off. The top of your head was cut off when you're sitting.
How is that? Is that good?
Let me ask her.
All right. So hopefully, can you take a look,
Yeah.
Phil?
How's
Thank
that?
you. Is that better?
It's high tech here, you know.
All right, sorry.
Would you like to stand?
Stand.
I'll give you a touch more.
Hold on. Ah!
Just a tad. There you go.
All
Like
right.
live theater.
Okay, you see? Facebook Live, is that better?
Oh, yes. No stand.
Standing?
Beautiful.
All right,
Yes,
beautiful.
beautiful.
Okay.
All right. So
Use
the
my back.
Thank you, Ariel.
Facebook Live, thank you, Ariel. My daughter was
She's
apparently
watching.
worried,
Right
she's
there.
watching.
Well, people were commenting, she saw it,
And so,
it's
thank
fixed.
you. What you just heard, of course, was actually the opening segment of a show that I wrote in 1994 called Too Jewish. But I actually wrote that show that segment many years earlier when we did a benefit for the Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater and the YIVO Institute on Broadway at the Schubert Theater. Actually, this one was at the Circle in the Square. And I remember writing that segment specifically for that event, and it eventually became the opening of my show, and now it's yours. As I told you, I grew up in the Bronx, and I grew up in an area of the Bronx that was all Yiddish, and we were probably one of the last of the Mohicans, so to speak, who were so enveloped in Yiddish culture and Yiddish language. We had, as I said earlier, some of the great families who, to this day, the Schechters, of course, Sola Rochel Schechter, I don't know if she's watching, is the editor of the Yiddish Forward. Her brother Binyamin Schechter is a musical director and a brilliant composer and arranger in Yiddish. He runs the Yiddish chorus, their sister Gittel. Then the Gottesmans. Itzikel Gottesman is a professor of Yiddish in Texas. The Fishmans, Dovidel Fishman and his father Schickel were some of the greatest linguists. To this day, Dovidel is one of the great linguists in the world. And of course the Molotics were there, and the Gottliebs were there, and Tzip Valetsky and Josh Valetsky. Tzip was a great artist, and my mother was a teacher at the Sholem Aleichem school. And so that's where I started my career. And so when I was growing up, what I heard all the time were all these beautiful Yiddish songs I was brought up to sing all these beautiful Yiddish songs. So I'm going to share one song with you before I continue into my story, because this probably is one of my favorite Yiddish songs ever written. It's called Auf'm Weg steht a Boim, which means by the side of the road there stands a tree. And it was written by one of the most beloved of Yiddish poets, and my personal favorite, Itzik Manger. Now this song, it's all about a little boy who's sitting at home in the old country, and it's the winter, and it's very cold, and it's stormy outside, and he's looking out the window, and by the side of the road he sees a tree standing a little crooked. And on the tree there are several birds. And as this little boy watches, the birds fly away in all directions, east, west, south, leaving the tree all alone in the cold. So this little boy, he goes to his mother, he says, Mama, please, if you let me, I'll go outside and I'll become a bird. You see, Mama, I'll go to the tree and I'll become a bird and I'll fly up to the tree and I'll keep it company and I'll keep it warm through the harsh winter. Auf'm Weg steht a Bäum, steht eingebogen. Alle Vögel von dem Bäum sehnen sich zu fliegen. 3 kein Misrach und 3 kein Meile, und der Rest kein Duren, und dem Bäum gelost allein, heftiger von Sturen. Sog ich zu der Mammen her, sollst mir noch nicht sterben, weil ich Mammen zu weh bald a Vogel werden. Ich will sitzen auf dem Bäum und ich will ihn verwiegen. Übern Winter mit der Trist und mit der schönen Nigen. And the mother says, absolutely not. She starts to cry. She says, you want to go outside? Fine. I'll let you go outside, but only on one condition. That you put on your hat and your scarf and your galoshes so that you don't freeze to death in the cold outside. Sogt die Mame nicht ein Kind und sie fängt mit Tränen. Kennst du Lille auf dem Bäum, mir verfreuen werden. Sog ich Mama, sie ist schon deine schöne Augen. Und jeder Bus und jeder Bett bin ich mir a Vogel. Fängt die Mame, Itzik rein, nehm Gottes Willen, nehm Gott mit der Schalekel, der soll sich nicht verkehren. Die Kaloschen nehm dir mit, sie geht a scharfer Winter, und die Kutsche mit du dir an, oi weiß mir, und winkt mir. And then the mother says, she says, please, put on your heavy overcoat, otherwise you'll surely die, and you'll end up in the graveyard with all the corpses. How's that for Jewish guilt? So this little boy, dressed in all these clothes, he goes outside, he goes to the tree, and he tries to fly. And he realizes that because of all the clothing, because of his mother's overbearing love, he might never be able to fly. Und das Winterleibel nimm, tu es du scheute, heut du willst nicht sein kein Gast, viel zu viel Sachen hat mein Mame umgetan, ihr Fegerle dem Schwachen. Guck ich treurig mir rein in mein Mames Augen, so dir Liebschaft nicht gelost, werden mir a Vogel auf dem Weg steht a Bäum, steht eingebogen, alle Vögel von dem Bäum sehnen sich zu fliegen. Ay, chiri biri 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 bum. Ay, chiri biri 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 bum. Thank you. Phil Hinton on the piano, ladies and gentlemen. So that song was also sung in many, many different shows I've done, and the arrangement that I did in my Two Jewish show was written by Ben Schechter, who was my musical director at the time. It's truly beautiful. When I was at the Sholem Aleichem Folkschule, number 21 on Bainbridge Avenue, that's where I started my career in the Yiddish theater. My first professional job was actually at the Folksbiene when I was 10 years old, but I'll get to that later. But the basis, the foundation of my Yiddish theater career actually started in the Yiddish shule on Bainbridge. My mother was one of the teachers, and of course she went on to a career as a professor at Columbia University for 25 years. And she wrote the first musical that I ever starred in. It was called Aleph Avremel, and it was all about this little boy, Aleph Avremel. My name, of course, was Avi Avremel, Avrom Avremel. So Aleph was the first letter of my name, and I was a brave little boy who, of course, goes into the forest, and he sees this very large, big, angry Bays bear, okay, a bear. Bays, of course, means angry in Yiddish, but it's also the second letter of the Yiddish alphabet, Aleph Bays, Gimel Daled, and Bays is also the first letter, of course, in the word bear. So the whole show was basically an introduction to the letters of the Yiddish alphabet, and I got to be the star of the show. So I'm going out into the forest, I come across this bear, and of course the bear is angry, and he wants to do me harm. And it went something like this. Aleph Avremel is gegangen in Wald, Beis hat a Bär in der See, dorten bald. And then the bear says, Yam, 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 Avremel, du bist doch a Süßinke, yam, 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 you're so sweet, yam, 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 du bist doch a Gittinke, you're so good, yam, 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 ich will dich aufessen, I will eat you up, Arr. Thanks, Mom. It was a little scary, but of course I was the brave young boy, and I took my axe and I chopped the bear up into tiny little pieces, and I fed him to all the other letters of the Yiddish alphabet. Lovely. Which actually brings me to a very interesting point about Yiddish theater and Jewish theater in general. It always comes back to food. But that was my first production, my first leading role in the Yiddish theater, a little children's show that my mom wrote. And it wasn't long after that that my parents took me to my first Broadway show. And of course, at the time, this was the mid-60s, Fiddler on the Roof had come out in English on Broadway. And that was my first Broadway show. And I will never forget how incredible it was to see Jewish life portrayed on the stage in such a magnificent way. And it was based on Yiddish, on the Sholem Aleichem stories, and of course the Folksbiene did a beautiful and very successful production of Fiddler in Yiddish. About a year and a half after it played on Broadway, the rights were given out, and the community center in the Bronx on Hillman Avenue, right across my school, PS 95, did a production of Fiddler on the Roof, all children. And of course, who got to play Tevye? Yours truly. And who do you think was the music director? His truly, Zalman Malotic, the artistic director of the Folksbiene. I was 8, he was a little older, and we did Fiddler on the Roof at the community center. I became the 8-year-old Zero Mostel. Dear God, with the Bronx accent, dear God, you made many, many poor people. I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. And so that was my first Tevye. Of course, I've gone on to do Tevye several times since then, all in English, and perhaps someday I'll get to do it in Yiddish, because what a magnificent role. Shortly after that, I went to see my first Yiddish theater production on Broadway, and that really changed my life. For those of you who may remember, there was a show called The Megillah of Itzik Manger, who wrote the Auf dem Weg steht der Boy. And the Folksbiene did it several years back, and I was privileged to be a part of it. It is maybe my favorite, one of my favorite Yiddish musicals ever. And at the time, it starred one of the most important celebrity Yiddish families in the world. Mike Burstyn was the young ingenue, the young lead who played Fastrigosse der Schneiderjung, Fastrigosse, the tailor boy. And his parents, Pesach Geburstein and Lillian Lux, played the king and the queen, Queen Vashti and King Achashverosh. I knew every line of that show by heart. I knew every song. Probably to this day, I could recite the entire show by heart. And after the show, I was so blown away. Seeing Mike Burstyn on the stage he became my idol. He was my idol. I was a young boy. I was maybe 8, maybe 9 at the time, and I demanded that my mother take me backstage to meet him and get his autograph. And so I tell him this story every time I see him. We've, of course, become very dear friends since then. And I waited for him outside the stage door. He was maybe 18 or 19 years old. He came out of the stage door, big, beautiful man. And he saw me and he said, "Oh, hello, little boy. What's your name?" And I said to him in Yiddish, "My name is Avi Hoffman." My name is Avi Hoffman, which was my name at the time. And he said, "And what do you want to be when you grow up, Avi?" I said, "I want to be an actor, just like you." And he took my playbill and he wrote, "Dear Avremale, may you have a long and successful career, Mike Burstyn." And I still have the playbill, and I show it to him every time I see him. And so I basically have him to blame for my career in the Yiddish theater. And that was a life-changing event, because after that, all I wanted to do was be in the Yiddish theater. And about a year later, the Folksbiene, which was still down on East Broadway at the time, was doing a play by Osip Dimov called Bronx Express, 1968. I was 10 years old, I auditioned, and I got the part. the part of the young son in the play. It was basically a Yiddish melodrama with socialist overtones. It was all about a tailor, a poor tailor, lives in the Bronx, and every morning he gets up early before dawn. He gets on the Bronx Express, the subway, and he goes all the way down to the Lower East Side, to the sweatshop. He sweats. He sits behind the sewing machine for 12, 13 hours, whatever it was. And then after dark, he gets back on the Bronx Express, and he goes all the way back up to the Bronx to share his measly earnings with his poor family. And one day, he goes down to work, and on the subway, he meets a friend from the old country, and who had come with him on the boat. And the friend has become very successful. He's wearing a fur coat with a fur hat and diamonds on his fingers. And he looks at my father's character. He says, "Chatzkel, das bist die, this is you. Oi, Chatzkel, look at you. You've done nothing with your life. Bist geblieben agunish, bist gewein agunish, bist geblieben agunish." And my father's character says, "Oi, Gott in you. Oi, Moishe, geh noch a kick of dir, look at you. Bist geworden a Gewir. You've become such a successful, rich man. Fur coats, fur hats, diamonds." He says, "My name is not Moishe anymore. You can call me Maximilian." In any event, Maximilian convinces my father to leave his family and go with him to Wall Street to become a big success and pursue, fame and fortune. And he does. He leaves his family behind, those poor greenhorns, and he leaves us. And my character, the young 10-year-old Yossale Hungerstolz, Yossale Hungerstolz, suddenly has to become the breadwinner of the family. And the only way I could make money was to shine shoes back then. And so I ended up shining shoes all over the city. And I end up down on Wall Street, shining shoes on Wall Street. And you can imagine it's a melodrama. So of course, at one point, I find myself shining the shoes of my own father. I will never forget these lines. I'm shining his shoes. I look up and I recognize him, my father, and I say, "Tate? Tate! Tate, du bin ich, dein Jüngerle Yossale! Papa, this is me, your son, Yossale! Oi, Tate! Du kennst mich nicht! You don't recognize me, oi, Tate! Tate, komm heim! Komm zurück heim zu deiner Sprache. Come back home to your family. Oi, Tate. Not bad for a 10-year-old, right? In any event, that performance actually got me my first New York Times review. The New York Times said, Avi Hoffman displays a sense of humor, which just goes to prove you cannot believe the reviews that you necessarily read in the paper. But that was my first professional Yiddish theater job. I was 10 years old, I got paid, I did the show, and it was quite successful. And I thought, that's it, I'm ready for a career, not only in the Yiddish theater, but I was ready to become a star on Broadway. Of course, my father had other ideas. He decided a year later that we were going to move away from New York, and we found ourselves halfway across the world in Long Island. No, I'm just kidding. We moved to Israel. And so in August of 1969, I suddenly found myself an 11-year-old boy living in Israel. I didn't speak a word of Hebrew. It didn't take me long. Lamati Ivrit toch shisha chodashim, toch shana. I was speaking fluently, just like an Israeli. But what I found, amazingly enough, is that Yiddish was persona or language, lingua non grata in Israel. Nobody wanted to speak Yiddish. Nobody wanted or to be involved in Yiddish theater. And I found out years later that actually in 1951, the Israeli government put out a law, a rule, that said that Israeli performers and producers were not allowed to do Yiddish theater. This is true. Only years later, if people came from outside of the country, they were allowed to perform in Yiddish. But in 1951, Israelis were not allowed to perform in the Yiddish language. Now, of course, it's very different. There's a national Yiddish theater in Israel called Yiddish Spiel, and they do amazing work. They've created a conservatory to develop a new generation of Yiddish actors. But the 10 years that I spent in Israel, I never was involved in Yiddish, so I won't tell you about that, because this is about my life in Yiddish theater. I came back in 1977. I got a degree at the University of Miami, and I did a few shows locally. I'm here in Florida, by the way, for those of you who don't know. I actually live in Coral Springs, Florida. In 1981, Ben Bonus, the famous Yiddish actor who was married to the great Mina Byrne, had heard through the grapevine that I had come back to the United States and that I was still performing and still spoke Yiddish. And he called me up and offered me the lead role in a new Yiddish show that he was producing called The Schmied's Techter, the blacksmith's daughters, or the Schmied's Tochter, excuse me, the blacksmith's daughter. I didn't think I was right for the lead role, as you can well imagine, but he explained it to me. This was another kind of a Yiddish melodrama in the old country, a blacksmith who has a daughter who falls in love with this young man, a very handsome young man, and of course the father disapproves, and eventually they get married. And so I was supposed to play the young groom. I was young then. I was tall. I had hair. In any event, I came to New York ready to be in this great Yiddish show. And I'll never forget, I came into the first day of rehearsal, and the great Ben Bonus, I mean, he was an icon in the Yiddish theater. A very distinguished elderly gentleman. He must have been about 83 at the time, had this gorgeous head of gray hair. He called me over, he said, Avremali, come here. Come here. I want to tell you something. I've been thinking. I'm not sure that my audience is ready to see a show where I am not playing the lead role. So I've decided that I'm going to play the young man, and you, my friend, you're going to play a very small but very important role of the 80-year-old bookseller. And indeed, that's what happened. I was 22, 23. I played the 80-year-old bookseller. He was 83. He played the 23-year-old young ingenue. I will never forget, I had to come out on stage with a big wagon full of books, and I came out and I said, Bücher zu verkaufen, für billige Preisen, jeden kauft a Bücher. Books, cheap books, books for sale, very cheap. Jews buy a book. And that, of course, was where Yiddish theater died. Of course, it didn't die, and it will never die, because very shortly after that production, a group of young people got together to do a tribute on the 75th anniversary of the Jewish Forward, the Yiddish Vorwärts newspaper. It was in upstate New York at the Stevensville Hotel, and the people who put it together are people you probably know. They may be watching right now: Zalman and Moshe Rosenfeld and myself and Eleanor Risa and Joanne Bortz and Phyllis Burke. And we did this tribute to Yiddish theater and the forward of 75 years. And it was a magnificent evening. And the audience was so blown away. And the standing ovation at the end went on for a very long time, that Moshe and Zalman decided to turn it into an off-Broadway musical, which eventually became The Golden Land. And I was very privileged to be in the Golden Land from the day it started, through all of its different evolutions. It was at the Norman Thomas Theater. We did a national tour, Philadelphia, the American Musical Theater Festival, and eventually we came back in a large-scale off-Broadway production at the Second Avenue Theater. Now, I thought I knew a lot about the Yiddish theater and about Yiddish culture in general, but I have to give a lot of credit to Moshe and Zalman, because when they wrote The Golden Land, I was suddenly introduced to a world of material that I had never come in contact with, which was amazing. I also got to work with some of the greatest talents, as I mentioned, Eleanor Risa and Joanne Bortz, Neva Small, Mo Hannon came in for a while, but probably the greatest was someone who became my very dear friend for decades. He passed away, almost 10 years ago, more. The great Brucey Adler. And he taught me so much about comedy and drama, and he was a triple threat. And so The Golden Land, for me, was truly a revelation. Oh, you know what? I skipped.
Yeah.
That's all right. Let's skip.
Okay.
All right. Sorry, we're live and we didn't rehearse. So yes, there you go.
Yeah, okay.
Truly a revelation. Bye 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 W-E-V-D. Bye 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 W-E-V-D. I bye 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 every Sunday morning over WEVD. This is WEVD Debs Radio, the station that speaks your language, Git Mo. And now for the weather report. Today the weather is nishtahin and nishtahe. If you want to know if it's raining, I can't tell you because there's no window here in the studio, so stick your head out your own window and then you'll know. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to announce that we have with us in the studio today one of the greatest Jewish comedians, one of the greatest Yiddish vaudevillians of all time. Please welcome Mr. Menashe Skolnick. So, how are you? Você ainda kennt mich nicht. You don't recognize me. Das bin ich. This is me, Menashe Skolnick. Last week on 2nd Avenue, much to my surprise, a giant of a man shoved a lady half his size. A voice yelled, "Cut it out!" Then I noticed it was me. I said, better you should learn to treat a lady tenderly. If you wanna fight, fight with me, you let's. He was stronger than he looked, and he gave me a zet. You know where? Not on the top, not on the bottom, but just in the middle. The lady picked me up and she brushed me off with care. She said, "Who asked you?" And she clapped me, you know where. Not on the top, not on the bottom. hospital to have an operation. I went to pay my visit, 'cause I know it's no vacation. Jake wasn't in his room, so I lay down and slept right in his bed. Jake ran off with a noise, so it's me they took instead. To a surgeon operating his heart, one doctor said to the other, where would you like to start? You know where? Not on the top, not on the bottom, but just in the middle. They kept me in that hospital from Pesach till Yom Kippur. I sued them for malpractice, 'cause they sewed on me a zipper. You know where? Everybody. Not on the top, not on the bottom, but just in the middle, and that's all. Now, Phil Hinton on the piano. Wow. I can't believe it's already 46 minutes. Oh my God. I talked way too much. In any event, the Golden Land introduced me to Menashe Skolnick. It introduced me to some of the greatest songs and sketches of the Yiddish theater and the Yiddish cultural world. I think we're going to skip Brother,
Okay.
but I do want to go back to the medley,
Okay.
to the Yiddish medley.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. We'll let me tell another story, and then we'll kind of get to that, and then we'll finish the way we planned.
Mm-hmm.
So the Yiddish theater was one of the most successful genres in the world. I actually taught a course 2 semesters ago at the University of Miami called the Yiddish Theater, the Foundation of Modern Culture. And so my hypothesis was that out of the world of Yiddish theater and the Yiddish world of the Lower East Side between the 1880s and the 1940s came everything we know today as modern culture. Broadway, Hollywood, music, comedy, every aspect of what we now think of as television, most of the creative forces in all of those areas came out of that world of the Yiddish theater. But because of circumstances, some natural, some unnatural, the Yiddish theater started to wane. In the 1940s, after the World War II, there was suddenly an association of Yiddish with the Holocaust and with those who suffered in the concentration camps. They came and spoke Yiddish. My father, of course, my parents were both survivors of the war, and they were discouraged from speaking Yiddish. So by the time the 60s and the 70s and the 80s rolled around, Yiddish theater was definitely in a decline. But the Golden Land was the first modern revolution in the Yiddish theater. And it started a movement because after the Golden Land, there were new shows. I remember The Rise of David Levinsky was something I was involved in the mid-'80s. And although it wasn't in Yiddish, it was based on the writings of Abraham Kahan, the editor of the Yiddish Forward. By the time the 90s rolled around, we had gotten involved with Joe Papp at the Public Theater and created a Joseph Papp Yiddish Theater, which is now starting to come back again, where we did a great musical written by my mother called Songs of Paradise. And that was a modern version of Yiddish. It was original material with new compositions, rock and roll and rap. Eleanor Risa and I worked together on that extensively. Rena Burrow co-wrote it with my mother. Rosalie Jarrett wrote the music. David Kenner was in it, and the great Adrian Cooper, Alea Sholem. So Yiddish theater started to really make a comeback in the late 80s and into the 90s. By the time I wrote my first one-man show, Too Jewish, in 1994, Yiddish theater was starting to come back. And between the 1990s and the early 2000s till now, we've seen this amazing renaissance of Yiddish theater, culminating in the great Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. But before that, if you go back to the earlier years, you see, great works coming out of many different areas. Obviously, the Folksbiene. But also, I want to give credit to people like David Mandelbaum at the New Yiddish Rep, who did Waiting for Godot in Yiddish, which I was involved in. And then, of course, The Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller's great classic in Yiddish, which I was very privileged to be able to play Willie Loman and nominated for many awards and an amazing accomplishment. And so all over the world now, we're seeing all these great new Yiddish productions, not just in theater, but also in film. The film Menashe. I made a film in Canada a few years ago called Schchite, which means slaughter, a 30-minute Yiddish short psychological thriller horror movie in Yiddish, all about Jews being forced to shop retail. Just kidding. No, it's actually not about that. It's all about an Orthodox community dealing with a terrible tragedy in their community and how they deal with it. And it won awards all over the world and was even eligible for an Academy Award. This past year, it won the Holly Shorts Festival in Los Angeles for Best Thriller. In any event, Yiddish is over 1,000 years old. And the body of work in Yiddish is so deep and so extensive and so rich that it will take another 1,000 years for it to continue to blossom. And so I am very honored to be a part of this world. Television shows like Shtisel on Netflix, and now the new one, Unorthodox, where Yiddish is such an integral part of what's happening in the programming. So it's quite fascinating, and I'm very privileged to be a part of it. I'm very privileged to have been asked to be a part of this evening. And so I'd like to do a medley. I'd like to sing every famous Yiddish song ever written. And you're welcome to sing along if you like. You'll probably know many of these songs. Fiedel mit Fiedel, alle mit Bass. Das Leben ist ein Liedl, du wirst einen Kass. Hey, Idel, Fiedel, Schmiedel, hey. Bei mir bist du schön, bei mir hast du Geld, bei mir bist du auf der Welt, bei mir bist du schöne wie die Levone, lichtig wie der Stern, fin Himmel am Tonne. Sie regnet, sie kappet, der alte Mann krabbet. A bissl Sinn, a bissl Regen, a Riegel, dem Kopf zerlegen, a bin gesinnt, kann mit glücklich sein. Masel, es scheint amul für jeden noch nicht für mich. Masel, du bringst an jeden Frieden. Fahre, säumst die mein Tier. Was ist gewähnt, is nicht du. What was, and isn't anymore. It's a very philosophical Yiddish song. In dem Beis Hamikdash, in a Winkel wenn jochen Liederlen wirkt sie Gesede in singt ihm zum Schlafen a Liederle schön. Ai, Lilu, Lilu, Lilu. Pachi, Pachi, Kichalach, Tate koifen Schichalach, Mamet koifen Säckalach, Oja gesinnt in deine Bäckerlach, die reute Pomeranzen, Fiesach, was beten sitzen tanzen. Es ist nicht, sind alle mit, Leben soll Columbus, trink wieder Lachlechaien, Leben ist so bells, mein steht alle bells, mein Heim alle Wichon, meine Kinder schön verbracht. Seid ihr amol gewesen im Bett, mein steht alle bells, in Urewen Stiebale, mit alle Kinder lacht dort, gelacht der Wind im Korn, lachten, lachten, lachten alle Chassiden, lachten alle Chassiden, und als der Rebbe lacht, als der Rebbe lacht, ist gewohnt sehr freilach, in der Melach, und der ist getan die Twill, und hat dann getan die Brill, und geschickt noch die Fiddler, die zwei. Idel mitten der Fiedel, Arie mitten Bass, das Leben ist a Lidl, das ist ein Kass, Edel, Fiedel, Schniedel, hey. All right. I know a lot of you are sitting there, or standing there, saying, wait a minute, Avi, you didn't sing my favorite Yiddish song. I understand. So now, I would like to sing all the remaining famous Yiddish songs I've written, but I have to divide them up into three categories. So the first category includes songs with the word Mame in them. Oy Mame, bin ich verliebt, mein jiddische Mame, a Brivele der Mame. Mame, how I love you, my dear old Mame. All right, the second category includes songs with the name Yankele in them. Dort geht Yankele, dort steht Yankele. Ich will mein Yankele, mein Schäde. Ay, mein Yankele doodle dandy, Yankele doodle do or die. All right, the third category. The third category includes all the songs that don't fit in the first two categories. Kupitsche Käufche, Papyrosten. Es sind dick Bulbis, dies dicke Mittwoch Bulbis. Jamme, spiel mal Lieder, was das Mädel will. Jossel. Tumbala, laika. Oh. Say make it with a little help from my flying. Say make it with a little help from my. Well, you don't recognize that Yiddish song? That song was written by Lenin and Kototsky. All right, look, if I didn't sing your favorite Yiddish song, please send me a note, write me an email, call the Folksbiene, and I'll try to put it into the next show that I do, all right? Here we go. Das Leben ist ein Spaß. Hey! Thank you. And that, my friends, is my show. It's an hour exactly on the dot. Isn't that something? An hour and 8 seconds. Although, frankly, I would like to sing one more song. And so I'm going to go over the hour just a little bit if it's okay with you. I have no idea how many people have been watching this program, and I'm sure I'll find out as soon as I get behind the iPad. But this has been kind of fun and weird. And in this time that we are living in, and says I'm a shigas, it's a crazy time. But out of the craziest times come the greatest changes and the greatest accomplishments and the greatest creativity. And so I know that we will all come through this time stronger. And I truly believe that we will find new and exciting ways to keep Yiddish alive and Yiddish culture thriving. I'm doing everything I can. Tomorrow night I'm doing another Facebook Live event on the Yiddishkeit Initiative page. So find us on Facebook, Yiddishkeit Initiative. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock we're doing Yiddish tangos. But the most important, Yiddish play probably, or Jewish play, probably has to be Fiddler on the Roof. And so I would like to close my program with a song that was written for Fiddler on the Roof. But it's actually a song that many of you may never have heard. It was written for Fiddler, but it was taken out of the show in the out-of-town tryouts. I think they took it out in Philadelphia. It was called When Messiah Comes. And I guess the reason they took it out is because I guess they felt that this song was maybe a little bit too Jewish. When Messiah comes, he will say to us, I apologize that I took so long, but I had a little trouble finding you. Over here a few, and over there a few. You were hard to reunite, but everything is going to be all right. Up in heaven there, how I wrung my hands when they exiled you from the promised land. Into Babylon you went like castaways on the first of many, many moving days. What a day and what a blow! How terrible I felt, you'll never know. Since that day, many men said to us, get thee out, kings they were, gone they are. We're still here. When Messiah comes, he will say to us, I was worried sick if you'd last or not. And I said to God, I said, would that be fair? If Messiah came and there was no one there, and the Lord replied to me, wait, everything will be all right. You'll see. Since that day, many men took our homes, took our Phil, turn around and say hello to the audience.
Hello to the audience.
All right. Thank you all.